18 months ago, I decided it was finally time to become serious about Mandarin Chinese. So I took the plunge into Immersion, and I decided I would use Refold as my guiding light through the process. So this is my third update video. Let's talk about it. My 18-month journey started in June of 2022, and my first video was about the 500 hours of immersion that I did between June of 2022 and January of 2023. So what did I do during this period? So first up, the headliner, I watched 500 hours of TV shows while being fully engaged, but not doing any lookups or intensive activities. I also added 1,300 Anki cards to my pre-existing deck, which brought my total up to 3,100 cards. A couple side notes about this. First off, my cards were audio only on the front, and I'd been working on this deck for about a year prior to jumping into Immersion. This was me just trying to build a foundation before I got serious about language learning. The result of this, I went from having virtually no ability to parse TV shows in Chinese to being able to get the gist of the plotline of relatively easy content to comprehend. Now, my second update video I made once I crossed the 1,000 hours of total study mark. This video recapped what I had done between February and June of 2023. So first up, I continued immersing in TV shows in Chinese. I added about 900 more cards to my Anki deck, which raised my total to approximately 4,000 cards. I started utilizing a modified version of the Refold Chinese deck, and by modified, what I mean is I only had the target word and the example sentence on the front. I removed all the hints. I also completed Pimsleur's units 1 through 3 during this period, and the result was I started to grasp grammar that was dissimilar to English. I was constantly hearing words that I knew, and I would quite often pick up short sentences in their entirety in short exchanges of dialogue between characters in what I was watching. So fast forward about 6 months, and that brings us to today, where we're at the 18-month milestone. Now, 18 months, there's a lot of ambiguity in what study I'd been doing. So let's go over the numbers. First off, I've spent a combined total of 1,368 hours on studying. This equals about 2.5 hours of study a day, and you may say 18 months is a long period of time. There must have been some substantial peaks and valleys during that time. So I decided to take a close look at the data and segment up the 18 months into 3-month bite-sized pieces and see what the average was for those. And they came out to just about 2.5 each time. So I was very consistent with that. I've spent 911 hours immersing, and of that 911, 818 hours were free flow, 93 were intensive. With Anki, I've raised my total amount of cards to 4,366, and if you're wondering, I spend about a half hour on Anki a day. And I also completed Pimsleur's up to lesson 10 of Unit 5. Yes, I gave up at that random point. We'll get into that. But first, let's talk about the most impactful change I have made since my last update video, and that is intensive immersion. Now, I want to make something clear before we jump into this. I think intensive and reading go hand in hand. I suppose there are some ways you can intensively immerse without reading, but I'm not really sure about that. Regardless, reading and intensive immersion are sewn together at the hip in my mind. So with that in mind, I want to delay reading as long as possible to avoid becoming reading dominant. I've tried to learn languages before. I have several failed attempts. And by the way, I also tried doing AJAT for 18 months a long time ago. I'm going to make a video about that, but if you're interested in it, please let me know in the comments below, because I might make the video sooner rather than later if there's a lot of interest. Regardless, every time I studied a language, I noticed a trend that the thing I'd spend time drilling and being intensive about was the written language, when all my goals aligned with wanting to comprehend the spoken language. So this time I thought, when I tried learning Mandarin Chinese, I would just focus for as long as I could only on the spoken language. But around the 1,000 hour mark, I realized that in order to continue making meaningful progress, I would need to start doing intensive. So starting in June, I began doing some reading. It wasn't a lot at first, but by September, I was really starting to log some hours. And what was I doing? I was reading manhua and manga, that's translated into Chinese. I was reading this with the app Pleco's OCR, and I was also doing a bit of intensive watching, and I was doing that by going line by line through a TV show in MPV player. To kind of put it in perspective, I was doing this at about a 5-to-1 ratio in favor of reading. The results of this, I don't want it to seem like I'm overstating it, but I feel like I made a similar amount of progress in reading as I did in free flow, but in a fraction of the time. If you want to bookend my first 2 videos, I started by not being able to comprehend anything, and by the end of the second video, I was hearing words left, right, and center and getting some short sentences. That's pretty much my reading experience, but I've only been reading for 93 hours. So this has really been incredible, and the benefits have not been confined just to reading. I also feel like since I started doing a lot of reading, it's also helped speed up my progress in free flow as well. I knew avoiding reading would make progress slower. Anyone who's come out and said there might be some advantages to delaying reading, they also have said it would make progress slower, but I did not realize how much slower it would make things. So, do I regret what I've done? Do I feel like I wasted a bunch of time? Not really, but if I were to start over, I would still front load my journey with that 500 hours of free flow watching, but roughly at around the 400 hour mark, I would then introduce the Refold 1K deck, and then once I got to 500 hours, I would at that point jump into reading. So something else that's been aiding my reading is Anki. I cloned the deck that I was sentence mining and put the written sentences on the front instead of having the audio on the front. Now, because I'm focusing on this deck, I also have stopped sentence mining. And because I've stopped sentence mining, I've decided to add in a pre-made deck just to ensure there's a little trickle of new vocabulary and grammar coming in. I'm only doing like 1 card a day from the pre-made deck, but I still think it's better than nothing. And this may be a good opportunity to take a moment and kind of explain my Anki deck. So here's my structure. I have one master deck, and in the master deck, there are several sub decks. The main, most important deck is my sentence mine deck, which, as you can imagine, I've been sentence mining and making cards and putting them in there. Obviously, now I have this cloned version of the deck, but on top of that, I also have the Refold deck in the mix. I have the pre-made deck that I just mentioned, but I also have another pre-made deck by, I believe, Mandarin Chinese. This deck is what I was primarily working on in the year leading up to starting my immersion journey. But yeah, I have several sub decks and one main deck. Some people have asked me after my first video, if that 500 hours didn't include any intensive immersion, how did you sentence mine? And the reality is that when I sentence mined, I just didn't track that time. I didn't really view it as immersion because my focus was finding good sentences to create cards out of, not to immerse. So I guess I technically did do intensive immersion before when I was sentence mining, but I didn't really view it that way. So let's move on. Next category is about free flow immersion. My daily streak has continued. I've watched at least 20 minutes of Chinese every day for the last 18 months. But the thing when it comes to describing my progress now, previously I would say I heard no words, I heard a few words, I heard some words, I heard a word every sentence. It kind of builds up like that. This time around, something has changed. The most apt way for me to describe my comprehension is not in how often I'm hearing words and sentences that I understand. It's more to describe it this way. Imagine you have your hand on the dial of an old-fashioned radio, and you're turning that tuner knob. At first you hear static, and then you start to hear some muffled voices, but you can't quite make out what they're saying. Then there might be some interference from another channel, so it's static again. And then you get a burst of clarity when you pretty much line it up. You can hear exactly what they're saying. Then it kind of fades out as you continue to move the dial across the screen. And then it's back to being static, muffled, then static. That's how it feels. So I can't really say, yeah, I can understand more words than I did before. I guess that's technically true, but that's not how it feels. And I believe the reason for this is the measuring stick I was using before was how often I was hearing words I knew. Now, the thing I'm noticing is not how many words I know, but how those words interact with each other to create meaning. And I think that's why I seem to have had this fundamental shift on how I view my progress. It's kind of hard to convey what it's like to half understand a language, but the radio analogy is my best shot at trying to explain where I'm at right now. So other study activities. I said I got to Pimsleur's lesson 10, unit 5. There's 5 units of Pimsleur's, but I only got a third of the way through the last one. While the completionist in me wanted to continue, I just could not get any of the content to stick in my brain. By the 5th unit, the vocabulary was becoming so highly specific and on topics that I just didn't care about. I just couldn't, my mind was a sieve. I guess you could say, you're going to need these words at some point. You might as well just truck through it. You're that far along. But as hard as I tried, I could not get myself to remember what keynote speech and an e-commerce company's CEO, what those were in Mandarin. I just could not get it to stick, so I gave up. I also have done some passive, but not enough to track, and I haven't really incorporated it into my daily routine. I also briefly tried Glossica, but I didn't like it. And I also tried Outlier Linguistics course on Chinese characters. While it was interesting, I didn't find it was in line with what I was trying to achieve. It's more about a holistic understanding of the characters by learning about their etymology. It's really interesting, but it wasn't the path that I thought I needed to take in order to get to fluency. So let's sum it up. What are my results after 18 months? When we talk about reading, reading Manhua, I need a dictionary for about 35% of the words. And these words are the ones that are important to the plot. Because you might think, oh, flip that around. Does this mean I have 65% understanding of what's going on? No. While I can read some common set phrases, while I can read a lot of common words, this 35% of words that I need to look up really block my understanding of what's going on. I guess to put it in another way, what I'm trying to say is I can read a lot, but I can't read without a dictionary. When it comes to watching TV shows, I would say my comprehension is approximately a Refold level 3, and Refold defines that as you recognize around half the words used and you can understand the meaning of some full sentences. This plus the radio analogy I said probably sums up where I'm at pretty well. Now, I don't speak Mandarin yet, but when I say things I learned from Pimsleur's, people are amazed by my accent. I said in a previous video I was going to learn Pimsleur's primarily as a party trick, and boy was that a good idea. Now, Pimsleur's has also been very useful for grammar, but that's a topic for another time. I can't follow conversations like real people talking in Chinese, but I can quite often understand when somebody says a declarative single line statement. An example of this is about a week ago, I was at a Chinese restaurant. I'd gotten up from the table, but I forgot my coat at my chair. And so as I was walking away, a waitress who passed by said to me, 你的衣服, and then she looked at me a little closer, and after examining my visage, she decided she needed to repeat it in English. But regardless, I understood what she said. So these kind of direct statements, I can actually understand a fair bit. And I think just in general, I'm probably right on the cusp of really starting to enjoy my immersion. You can't log nearly 1,000 hours of immersion without enjoying at least some of it. But I think to really enjoy it as just content, I think I'm really on the cusp of being able to do that. As I've improved, I've had a lot of thoughts on the process. I've noticed a lot of interesting things. First up, either Refold is maturing at the same time that my Chinese ability is, or maybe I'm just finally getting what they're saying and they repeat themselves, so I'm understanding properly this time. But I find it really interesting that the next things I'm going to talk about, they've also addressed kind of recently. Perhaps the most controversial of the things I'm about to say is I believe there's an upper limit of how useful free flow immersion is on its own, or even when it's supplemented with Anki. Even though organizations like Refold or even Katsumoto had said that you should be doing other things as well, I was always kind of under the illusion that I could still make progress with just doing free flow. Like, I would get there eventually. And I don't actually think this is even technically true. It's kind of like an exponential curve that's going down, and it keeps getting lower and lower, but it'll never actually hit zero. I kind of think that might be true of just doing free flow, or even if you are supplementing free flow with Anki. Another thought I had was an unchanged study routine is a recipe for plateauing. Refold's roadmap basically says this because they recommend you do different things at different points. But the thing I didn't really realize was the importance of evaluating where you are, thinking about where you should be, and what you need to do to shore up the things that are not to where you want them to be. And another thought I had was struggling to get to an hour of study a day is likely a sign of being on the wrong path. And what made me think of this was I realized at some point, if I were to just do my daily minimums, I would do about an hour of study. First off, there's Anki. Anki takes me about a half hour, but in reality, if I'm rushing and I don't do any new cards, I guess I could get it done in 20 to 25 minutes. Secondly, to maintain my streak, I have to watch 20 minutes of Chinese content. And thirdly, I've now introduced a requirement of needing to spend at least 10 minutes reading or doing intensive immersion. So if 50 minutes to 1 hour is basically my minimum, I would have to suggest to anyone, at least anyone learning a language as different as Chinese or Japanese or perhaps Korean is to English, anyone in this camp, if you're spending less than an hour a day studying, you likely are going to need to rethink what you're doing and find ways to increase it. Of course, at the beginning, it's really hard to do that much, but once the ball's rolling, I think you should be at least hitting an hour a day. And if you're not, then you probably should reevaluate what you're doing. So tying that into the next segment here, some of my experiences I've had, I know life can get busy. Life has gotten busy for me as well. And one of those days where I just did my minimum was on a day where I had a 10-hour meeting. The company I work for, we're in the process of expanding into some new markets, so it's been crunch time lately, and I still managed to do my daily minimums that day. I think there should be a way to find an hour a day for study, and if you're not, then perhaps you need to rethink your daily routines, and yeah. But anyway, I have more experiences to talk about unrelated to this. The next up, which I thought was kind of interesting, is I hit a new high score a couple times in how much study I did in a day. A couple months ago, I hit 7 hours of study in one day, and then maybe about a month ago, I actually got to 8. And on those days, at night, when I went to go to bed, as I put my head on the pillow, I could like hear Chinese like ringing in my ears and reverberating in my head, essentially. It was a very interesting experience. And finally, just another unrelated experience is I've noticed that when I'm doing my free flow immersion, if my mind starts to drift, in the past, what I would do is I'd use willpower to bring it back. I'd catch myself drifting and I'd use willpower. Now at this point, before I even realize I'm drifting, what actually pulls me back is hearing short phrases that I can comprehend. That's actually what brings me back into attention. So that's it for this time. I really appreciate you getting to the end of this video. I plan on making more updates in the future, so if you want to subscribe, please subscribe. I also have some other interesting video ideas in relation to language learning. I'll be posting those soon. So thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next one.